thank you very much, and thanks for coming to this session. It's funny, I spoke here a few months ago. Sean Maloney just equalised out there, looking good. We were off to Paris and France, but how things change, eh? Still, there's the rugby. Anyway, so we do have a lot of sporting rivalries, but I think there's an awful lot in common between Scotland and Ireland. And I want to talk about this project we did, which I think is highly relevant, obviously, to our country, but to your country as well. It's probably got the worst title ever, the long list of projects, but bear with me. I think a subtitle for this could be Fantasy Infrastructure, and I'll explain as we go along. So this was a project we were asked to look at because the basic context was that there's a lot of money being spent in Scotland on infrastructure. Very little of it will actually help us meet our climate change targets. So we were tasked by our client to look at the types of infrastructure which would make us meet those targets, which would help. So in doing that, we had to look at the context for the project. So in Scotland, we have got some very ambitious climate change targets. We've also got a tradition of using big infrastructure projects to stimulate the economy. We've got a tight spending review coming up, so funding is going to be precious and a lot less than it used to be. We've got National Planning Policy Framework, 3 and 4, but we've also seen increased support for low carbon infrastructure, and we've now got a new £76 million European fund to bring forward low carbon infrastructure. We're starting to see a lot more project integration, which I think is particularly important for the sustainability story. And in Scottish Government, we have very much a sort of shared portfolio between ministers. So the Health Minister has to have an eye for transport. The other ministers obviously have to look where they can help support the 5 key Scottish Government priorities, which are smarter, greener, wealthier and fairer, healthier and smarter and safer. The other thing we did recently, of course, was to do a piece of work. It was called the Mini Stern Studies, and that was looking at how cities could introduce low carbon infrastructure, and we made recommendations of the types of things they should bring forward. So that was, again, additional context to this project. So, as I said, we spend a lot of money on infrastructure, and I think if you'll see from the bottom statement here, Scottish Government's economic strategy, it's not just about spending money to create infrastructure, it's how do you actually maximise that for the benefit of the country in terms of social, economic and environmental benefits. So it's a very well-rounded approach to sort of developing new bits of infrastructure, and I think it's a model that we'd like to see elsewhere. I think you'll see here it's very different from the UK government. It's a much more integrated approach, a much more inclusive approach, bearing in mind the psyche of the nation. A piece of work we did followed a previous study which looked at the infrastructure that was coming forward in Scotland, and it was classed into low carbon, neutral and high carbon infrastructure. So as you'd expect, the low carbon stuff was renewable energy, energy efficiency and rail projects. The neutral was social infrastructure, schools, healthcare, digital infrastructure. And not unexpectedly, the high carbon stuff was energy, roads, or non-renewable energy, roads and airports, of which we have been spending quite a lot of money on recently. And Lord Stern, who you may know of, brought forward the Stern report, said that if we are going to meet our climate change targets, then 72% of our investment has to be in low carbon infrastructure. And our feeling was that actually low carbon infrastructure does represent good value for money. You know, it tackles energy security, it creates jobs, it's better for the environment, and it addresses things like health benefits and community cohesion. So it's very much in line with what the government's trying to achieve. So yeah, that was our scope. So infrastructure that will enable Scotland's people and businesses to thrive and prosper in a low carbon society for many generations, etc. So we were asked to look at projects or programmes. There had to be a clear role for the public sector in developing these, because most of the money will still come from the private sector for infrastructure. We had to look beyond the current cycle of projects, so we weren't meant to look at things that were already in the public domain or were going to be developed. We had to look ahead and be quite innovative. They had to have a sense of place, they had to be transformative and bold, but they had to be realistic, so we couldn't come up with something that would be so far out that people wouldn't ever do it. So in terms of what we looked at where the emissions in Scotland come from at the moment, because obviously if we're going to come forward with projects, we're going to tackle emissions, we had to do it in areas where we could see scope. So this will be probably the same for any part of Western Europe, but energy supply is a big issue, transport and business and industry. So we then went out and we spoke to lots of infrastructure providers within Scotland. We spoke to academics. It was frankly the most interesting part of the project. We got to speak to a whole range of people, ask them where they thought we could actually tackle the climate change targets from in terms of developing new infrastructure. So that was very interesting. We came up with a number of projects from that. In terms of our client makeup, so the client was largely WWF, they led it, but they had quite an influential steering group. So they had the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, Oxfam, Ramboll, Scottish Cities Alliance, Institute of Civil Engineers, and Scottish Government were involved, but only in observer status, and they've been very interested in what's coming through, because we're about to, as I say, go through the spending review. So we're hoping that the recommendations we made will actually affect change in Scotland. So in terms of having gone out and spoken to all those people, we get quite a lot of feedback. Certainly no shortage of ideas for new projects, but a frustration that things weren't being taken forward. We've got a real preponderance for pilot projects in Scotland. We really seem to excel at pilot projects that work, but then are never taken to scale. Some of the issues around that are actual capacity within the local authorities. As was reflected in Ireland, the numbers of people working in the public sector to support these projects is definitely going down, and that is creating an issue. Collaboration is something that should be happening, but ultimately, when we did this with the 7 Scottish cities, it's good to talk about collaboration, but ultimately they all quite like to do their own thing, because it's about what you're doing in your own city. Something around heat networks, and that's a classic example where you do actually need to put quite a lot of investment in. But if you put in a heat network, then things will flow from it. You'll be able to get new projects out of that, but we weren't seeing that many of them coming forward. And it was essentially the chicken and egg situation. If you build it, it's the field of dreams, build it and they will come. So that was one of the areas we recognised. So, having done all this research and spoken to everyone, these are the 10 projects we came up with. And I'm not going to go into them all in detail. In fact, I'm not really going into them in detail at all. But you'll see there the kind of things we're talking about. So, quite a lot on the rail network. In Scotland, there's an ambition to dual all the roads between our major cities, which will actually just make the playing field less even for people wanting to put rail and passengers on, or people put rail and freight on train lines. So we had a couple of rail projects there. We also did the re-engineering of cities for non-motorised transport. I heard earlier in one of the speakers talk about the air quality issues, so that was a sort of no-brainer. We looked at low-carbon transport hubs. That's largely about that final mile, either for passengers or freight within the cities, so to actually create a hub where you could actually bring and distribute goods. We looked at district heating schemes, particularly for the high-rise flats. We've got a lot of high-rise flats in Scotland, so it was very much focused on that. We also looked at a semi-rural district heating network using geothermal heat in Fife. We also looked at an urban district heating network similarly, and very much a big programme on retrofit of public buildings for energy efficiency, which is now a policy priority for Scottish Government. And we also looked at developed consented pump hydro schemes and energy from wastewater programmes. Now, what I would ask you to do for a bit of participation, there's a website there at the bottom. That's where our report can be found. And in the best traditions of social media, you can go onto that website, you'll get details on all the projects, and I would encourage you to go on there and like the ones you like best, because this is very much a participative project. And the premise of it is that early in the new year, the top 3 projects will be subject to a ministerial conference, and we'll be looking to see how we actually get the money together to bring them forward. So it's not just a theoretical model, this could actually lead to the realisation of some of these projects. In terms of the case studies, so we did the 10 case studies. We looked at this was the structure for them. We had an overview describing the project. We then came forward with what our justification was in terms of carbon. We also talked about the role of the public sector, because I say that was very key. We talked about the carbon reduction opportunities, and again, that was a major factor in the project. We had to talk about the economic viability, because as I say, these are projects that had to be grounded in fact and opportunity, not just fantasy. We talked about the time scale. We looked at some comparisons, because you'll be aware that within Europe there's some absolutely fantastic projects that are ultimately low carbon, and for some countries these are just a way of life. So why can't we just copy them? We also looked at the role of smart technologies. I hesitate to use the term Internet of Things because I'm not quite sure what it means, but there was certainly a role for smart technologies in taking these things forward. We looked at how these could be done at a systems level approach, so not just for one city but across the whole Scottish geography. And then we looked how the case studies might link together, so they weren't just standalone projects. Could they actually work in tandem with some of the other ideas? So I'll just quickly skip through some of the project examples. I was hoping to be able to go live onto the website and have a look at them, but I believe that's not possible. So that's just some examples. So that was a new high-speed rail line between the Central Belt and Aberdeen. You'll be aware that Aberdeen, with the reduction in oil price, is a city in transformation. This was an idea to actually link it to the Central Belt to make it a more attractive way of travelling and reduce the numbers of cars going up and down the road. The other one I mentioned was the re-engineering of cities to make them more friendly for cyclists and motorists, and that I think reflects the planning talk we had earlier. We do need to make more livable places and be less reliant on the car. And also heard this morning in one of the other speakers talk about Amsterdam and their ambitions for decarbonising transport in the city. And then there's the project around the high-rise flats district heating, and we're already seeing some of those projects coming forward in Glasgow with Scottish and Southern Energy, which is the biggest district heating scheme in Scotland at the moment. We also had some notable runners-up. Some of these you may have heard of. Solar roads, we're seeing them in parts of Europe where you're actually creating roads with solar panels built into them. There's also the PaveGen thing, where as you walk across the pavement you generate energy, which is useful for public spaces. Celtic Renewables, that was a project using the spent waste from the whisky industry to create biofuels. We also looked at other things, social infrastructure. We did mention the Internet of Things, light rail, distributed storage, hydrogen. And this one here is very interesting. This is Heindel Energy, and this is a project that they're trying to get European funding for, but it's essentially when you have turbines and you've got excess energy, use that energy to pump water underground, which raises this huge piston. So it's a fantastic energy storage project. It's not so good in countries like Scotland where you've got hills and mountains and elevation, but for flat countries, very interesting project. So yeah, just to conclude, sort of key messages, the policy direction in Scotland is very clear. We're not going to go away from the low carbon ambitions the Scottish Government's got. The policy is slightly changing. We've been very successful in terms of implementation of renewable energy, and now we're looking very much at the next energy strategy will be around storage and energy efficiency. Funding isn't necessarily a constraint. There is money out there if you want to do projects, whether it's European funding or the continued public funding. Maybe not as much as it once was, but it is still there. Certainly there's a lack of flagship projects outside sort of big renewables. Flagship projects still seem to be roads and bridges. So we need to see some more flagship projects which are around sustainable infrastructure. Capacity to deliver is an issue, there's no doubt about it, in terms of the support that's out there. And there is, as I say, these are all projects that do create an opportunity to create jobs, reduce carbon and build wealth. So that's it from me. So thank you very much for listening.